His talk from the David Horowitz Freedom Center in Los Angeles is just over an hour.
And when Tony, it's a couple years ago when you broached the topic of this book, the Mexican Mafia. Frankly, I'd never heard of the Mexican Mafia. I had no idea that there was such a thing. We all live for those in the room here that live in LA, we're very familiar with gangs and street crime and the violence and the disruption that gangs cause to our everyday life. But we never thought of it in terms of a mafia. And when you bring up the term mafia, that raises all sorts of, the Sopranos and The Godfather and all that kind of stuff. We think of something very different than a local, street gang or, something on the corner in a neighborhood. Mafia means there's a hierarchy, there's command structures, and there's power. And when you think of mafia, street gangs may have power over a neighborhood, but mafias, when you think of a mafia, you think of power and control. When you have to include government, the media, police. You wonder how far those tentacles go when you use the term mafia. And I know that this is something that the press doesn't talk about. I'm certainly not old, but the Mexican Mafia was formed before I was born, so it's been around for quite a number of years. And you have to wonder why have we not heard of this? Why is it, it's maybe known in certain circles, but it's not known by the general public. And to be the first person that I know of to go out and publicly publish a book about the Mexican Mafia, where you're naming names and talking about all the people that make up this circle, takes a tremendous amount of courage. It's not an easy thing. I'm sure it wasn't an easy thing to write about. Again, even with the book out, we're getting some attention, and Tony's been on radio shows. I haven't seen the LA Times review the book, unless I missed that Sunday edition. I haven't seen this on the everyday news in Los Angeles. Where's the stories? This is a major story, and this is a major threat to our everyday life, and nobody's talking about it. It's just everything is hush-hush. So there's a reason why no one's talking about it, and maybe it's because of the intimidation and the threats. When you come out and you write about something that hasn't been discussed, it's very powerful. Then you've got to worry about your threats on your life, your family. So it'd be very easy just to say, I know about this and I've got all this information and research, but I really shouldn't write about this. Why am I going to stick my neck out and and threaten, have threats upon myself and possibly my family? So, Tony, we're really very thankful for you for writing this book, and I think you mentioned it. There could be 20 new books written from this book, and of course Tony will be signing the book afterwards. But this could spawn a lot of stories and newspaper reports, investigative reports. There should be books. There should be documentaries coming out of the research that was done in this book. We're waiting for that, and maybe that'll happen. But you have to start somewhere, so we're very thankful. So, Tony, Rafael, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thanks. As Michael mentioned, this is an organization. It's not a disorganized group of individuals. The Mexican Mafia was founded in 1957 in the California prison system. It was started with 13 individuals. And for the first 20 or so years of its existence, whenever anyone mentioned the name, there was always quotes around it. The newspapers would characterize it as the so-called Mexican Mafia or the Mexican Mafia in quotes. No one really believed that such an organization existed, even law enforcement who were sort of facing it. Fast forward from 1957 until 1992. In 1992, the Mexican Mafia initiated probably the most significant initiative of any organized criminal group in this country's history. On the afternoon of September 18th, 1992, some 1,500 to 2,000 Hispanic street gang members began to assemble as if on an invisible cue at the football field at Elysian Park. If people who live in LA know that Elysian Park also happens to be the home of the Los Angeles Police Department Academy. You'd have to wonder if it's insanity or some kind of hubris that would bring 15,000 known criminals out into the open in broad daylight to assemble and have essentially a gang summit within the very shadow of the Los Angeles Police Department Academy. Yeah, and no pun intended, but law enforcement at that time in 1992, as recently as 1992, really didn't consider the Mexican Mafia as a significant threat. Some gang cops saw evidence of it on the street. They attributed a few crimes to it, but they never really saw it as an organization until that day in September 1992. They were literally caught flat-footed. Again, no pun intended. The fact that they could do this in broad daylight really started law enforcement scratching their heads about the power and influence of this group. Interestingly enough, that was not the only summit the Mexican Mafia launched in that period, in that September timeframe, September 1992. There were similar meetings that took place at the parking lot of the Los Angeles Coliseum, in parks in Orange County, in San Diego, in the San Fernando Valley, in the San Gabriel Valley. And each one of these meetings was held by a ranking member of the Mexican Mafia. The major initiative that on those meetings, the major policy initiative that the Mexican Mafia launched was what I characterize as the vertical integration for the first time, of a prison gang and street gangs. There were 3 items on the agenda at those meetings. The first item was that from now on, there would be no more drive-by shootings committed by street gangsters. This was largely misinterpreted by the media as a truce. In fact, it was not a truce. It was anything but a truce. It was basically a change in the rules of engagement. Prior to that time, innocent kids and innocent women and flat innocent individuals were being killed accidentally by drive-by shootings. Drive-by shootings naturally attracted law enforcement attention. Law enforcement attention hurt the business of selling drugs and making money. So one of the issues that they discussed, that they issued orders that there would be no more drive-by shootings. Didn't mean there would be no more shootings. They said from now on, if there's any business to be conducted that involves guns and firearms, you're going to be doing it up close and personal to reduce the chances of innocents getting killed. The second item on the agenda was that from that day on, all Hispanic street gangs were to call themselves Sureños, or South Siders. It's the Spanish word for Southerner, or Sureño. And a Sureño basically was a gang. Sureños would be gangs who were swore their allegiance to the Mexican Mafia. They were told that from now on, anything we do, anything we say, you have to do. And the third item on the agenda was taxation. From that day on, every street gang that was involved in the selling of drugs or making money had to pay a certain tax, anywhere between 10 and 30% of their total drug retail sales to the Mexican Mafia. When you scale that up throughout all of Southern California, and you realize that there may be somewhere between 100 and 120,000 gang members, let's say from the Bakersfield down to the Mexican border, that's a tremendous amount of money that the Mexican Mafia started making. It's interesting that the reaction from the press and the media was at best muted. There was virtually no coverage on it. They talked about it, and a few editorials were written about it, but most of the editorials got it wrong. They misinterpreted this no drive-by initiative as a truce, and like I said, it wasn't a truce. It was a change in the rules of engagement. This power projection from the prison to the street, again, is something that has never happened before. And there are various mechanisms by which the Mexican Mafia, there's only about 250 to 300 members in the California prison system, locked up in prison and on the street. Yet, those 250 individuals control an army of neighborhood militias, which we call street gangs, Hispanic street gangs. And they are, in fact, soldiers. They refer to themselves as soldados, soldiers, and they're more than happy to do the bidding of the Mexican Mafia. very often you'll read press reports about another senseless shooting that happened somewhere in the city. They'll find some 17-year-old kid dead on the street for no apparent reason. And a lot of the times these homicides aren't solved. Sometimes they are solved. The term senseless really is it's easy shorthand for things that the press doesn't fully understand. Very often these so-called senseless shootings are the result of a Mexican Mafia assassination. In the book, I described a kid, 16 years old, who ran afoul of a Mexican Mafia brother in his neighborhood, a young kid by the name of Randy Morales. Randy was assassinated specifically because he ran afoul of a Mexican Mafia member. Unwittingly. I mean, he didn't even know what he was getting himself into. But the press in that one, again, gave it maybe, I don't know, 15 lines in the newspapers, and again, it was a senseless killing. Well, it wasn't until more than 11 years later that that homicide was actually solved and actually attributed to the Mexican Mafia. So when you read stories in the paper about some senseless killing that happened somewhere, you may never know. We may never know, and even law enforcement may never know exactly the motivations behind that homicide. In this particular case, it took 11 years for Randy Morales' murder to be attributed as an assassination ordered by a Mexican Mafia member. Interestingly, the person who ordered that assassination was in jail at the time, in prison. And it almost challenges believability, but the fact is that prison does not mean the end of a criminal career, especially if you're a member of the Mexican Mafia or you're somehow an ally of the Mexican Mafia. They do control the prison system in California. They control virtually every member, every inmate. There are somewhere between 117,000 inmates in the California prison system. The overwhelming majority of those are directly under the control of the Mexican Mafia. It is not an understatement to say that the MA controls the prison system. Correction officers tell me that they're basically there to feed, house, clothe, and medicate the inmates. But the actual running of the prison and what happens in the prison system is pretty much in the hands of the Mexican Mafia. For instance, if you're a Hispanic criminal, it could be a citizen, non-citizen, or even non-gang affiliated. If you commit a crime and you land in the Los Angeles County Jail, you're given two sets of instructions. The first set of instruction comes from the jail authorities themselves. These are how you're going to behave and how you're going to conduct yourself, and so on and so on. And then you're also given a set of instructions by the Mexican Mafia shot caller who's running that tier, or who's running that block, that cell block. And the MA calls them the X-Files. And these are the rules laid down by the MA to new prisoners being inducted into the LA County jail system. If you contradict one of the prison rules, you'll get written up. You'll get a 115 form with your name on it, and you're told not to do that again. If you go against the Mexican Mafia rules, the penalties are a lot harsher than a piece of paper. You could be assaulted all the way up to killed, depending on the severity of your infraction. Prison authorities know about it. They're almost powerless to do anything about it because the power is so pervasive. There are various mechanisms that the Mexican Mafia uses to exert their powers on the street. They've got a terrific information gathering and intelligence system, and a very effective and robust communication system. The prime mechanism is the fact that street gangsters, if you're a 16-year-old kid and you belong to Florencia 13 or Bowling Street or Avenues or Canoga Park, Alabama, you know full well that when you do caper and you commit a crime and you end up in the prison system or the jail system, you are now in their house. You are now in their backyard. So when you're on the street doing whatever crimes you do, and somebody from the Mexican Mafia comes to you and tells you, you're going to do this, you're going to pay your taxes, or you're going to go and regulate that guy who's not paying his taxes. If you value your health in your life, you better do what they tell you when you're on the street. Because if you end up in jail, you end up in their house. You become under their direct control. Fear is that mechanism that they use to control the behavior of street gangsters. And it's not just a few street gangsters. I said there's close to about 100,000 of them on the street, give or take. The information gathering system is also fairly elaborate and comprehensive. They use something called a burnout phone. Well, many burnout phones. And a burnout phone is a phone line that a Mexican Mafia associate establishes on the street. Legitimate phone line. They're called phone company. The phone company sets up the line. That number is then given to an associate or a member in the prison system. That number gets around the prison system fairly quickly. That number is used as a collect phone call because you can only make collect phone calls from prison. That number then becomes essentially a switchboard for information. You'll have somebody calling from Corcoran into that number. You'll leave a message, and when somebody calls from Calipatria State Prison, he picks up that message. Information goes out of the prison to the street and back into the prison. So if you have associates who are in different prisons all over the state, they communicate through these burnout phones. And I'll give you, for instance, how much traffic, how much information travel is conducted through these burnout phones. There was an FBI surveillance, and they put a tap on one of these phones in Boyle Heights. It was run by a guy named Shaky Joe Hernandez. Shaky Joe ran a burnout phone for 3 months until the phone was shut down because he couldn't pay the bill. And then they go on and pick up another phone. That's why they call them burnouts, because the bill is never paid. In a 3-month period, Shaky Joe Hernandez's phone recorded close to 10,000 collect phone calls from the prisons to his house. And he was there 8-9 hours a day, taking information and relating information from one prisoner to another prisoner. And he was also collecting information on the streets and feeding that into the system as well. So if something happens in Boyle Heights tomorrow morning, something that the Mexican Mafia should be aware of or wants to be aware of, that information gets into the prison system by tomorrow afternoon. And by tomorrow evening, an order will be sent out to take care of that particular piece of business. If somebody isn't paying their taxes, they hear about it in the prison system tomorrow, and they'll do something about it tomorrow night. And then someone on the street will be tasked to take care of that business. So we've got essentially a real-time information gathering and distribution system conducted by the Mexican Mafia, and to some degree other prison gangs, but the Mexican Mafia is probably the best exploiter of these kind of systems that of any prison gang. There is virtually no comparability between the Mexican Mafia and other prison gangs. There are other prison gangs, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Nuestra Familia up north in Northern California. But the Mexican Mafia is the only prison gang that has been able to project its power from the prison out onto the street, to have these street gang members, the militia, the street militias, do their bidding. They also communicate by means of kites. These are kites and green light lists, and huilas as they call them. Huilas is a Hispanic term for a message. Little tiny pieces of paper about that big are used to write messages on. They write them with a needle and shoe polish, or shoe black. These little pieces of paper contain the names of people and entire gangs to be green-lighted or targeted for assassination. And these are produced in the prison with the blessing of Mexican Mafia shot callers and released almost like a daily paper. There's a morning edition, an afternoon edition, and an evening edition. The changes and the alterations are made to these green light lists depending on the information received from the street. If in the morning, Shaky Joe or somebody on the street isn't paying their taxes, they may get information in the prison system by that afternoon. Oh yeah, he took care of it, he paid his bill. and then the next green light list will have his name deleted from it. This information hits the streets fairly quickly through visits, through family visits, and unfortunately sometimes through lawyer visits. Defense attorneys who, to do favors for their clients, often involve themselves in passing information from the prison onto the street. And then, of course, there are third-party letters, which fairly not used as often because they can be intercepted. If somebody in prison writes a letter to the outside, that letter is very often read. But then they get around that by some fairly elaborate and sophisticated cryptology. The Aryan Brotherhood has taught the Mexican Mafia how to use a Francis Bacon encrypting system that challenges even modern computer systems in its complexity. Francis Bacon developed his cryptological system in, I guess, the 1700s. What's the point of all this? What do they do? Why do they want to control the streets? Well, the reason is basically money. The Mexican Mafia sees itself as a business entity, a business organization who happens to use murder and intimidation as a tool of advancing their business. And they do this through taxation. Virtually every Hispanic street gang that involves itself in dealing drugs has to pay taxes to the Mexican Mafia. And that percentage could vary from as little as 10%, sometimes just $5 a week or something for a low-level dealer, up to $1,000 a week for a volume dealer. And again, you ask, well, how do they know who's dealing? How do they know who's selling dope? They've got a lot of street soldiers. They've got a lot of people on the streets who are constantly on the street, keeping an eye out for who's doing what. It's fairly common for some families to deal drugs out of their driveway or out of their kitchen window. It's a fairly common avenue of dealing dope. There have been moms who have been arrested and prosecuted for selling dope out of their kitchen window while they're doing the dishes. Somebody knocks on the kitchen window and hands them $20, and she hands them a balloon. When people on the street see this kind of activity, they realize somebody's selling dope, and then, of course, there'll be a knock on the door and say, whatever you're making, we want 30% of. If they comply, there's no problem. They'll actually even protect them from incursions from other drug dealers. If they don't comply, their first action is to rob them, take all their dope, take guns, property, whatever else they have. The second time around, if they continue to deal drugs without paying their taxes, is a murder, is an assassination. It doesn't take a green light from a Mexican Mafia member to kill a recalcitrant drug dealer. If you want to make your bones, if you're 16 years old and you want to impress the carnals, the brothers as they call themselves, you can take it upon yourself to assault or kill an errant drug dealer who's somebody who's not paying their taxes because you help them do the business. In fact, sometimes entire gangs are green-lighted. There are some gangs to this day in Los Angeles who call themselves tax-free gangs, and they also call themselves green light gangs. The reason they call themselves green light gangs is because there's always a green light on all of them. So if an entire gang refuses to pay their taxes, the entire gang is sanctioned for execution, and that means that any Sereno, anybody who allies themselves with the Mexican Mafia, is basically, that gang becomes a free fire zone. They could take any of them out at any time and earn bones, make their bones for the organization. And very often, again, these crimes are sometimes characterized as senseless. They don't know why this person got killed. Well, very often there's a reason behind it, and the reason happens to be taxation. More recently, there's been a number of heinous crimes attributed to Hispanic street gangs, and this is something I've been talking about for about 8 years, I guess. And it has to do with, for want of a better word, ethnic cleansing. This is a sort of a tragic development in the history of this criminal organization. In 1995, is the first recorded incident that I have of an innocent black, non-gang affiliated individual being killed purely because he was black. The motivation behind getting rid of black citizens from neighborhoods controlled by Hispanic street gangs with an alliance to the Mexican Mafia originated with the idea of blacks moving into the neighborhood, bringing gangs with them, and creating problems with drug sales. They figured if a black family moves into a neighborhood, a black gang will soon follow behind, and that black gang will get itself involved in drug dealing. It's going to cause a problem. So the Mexican Mafia issued essentially a preemptive strikes against blacks in their neighborhoods. I first became aware of that some time ago, like I said, about 8 years ago. It happened with a fellow by the name of Kenny Wilson. Kenny Wilson is a 38-year-old male black who was visiting friends on Monte Vista Avenue in Northeast Division in Highland Park. He visited. He went out with friends that night. He came back. He got into his friend's car to park it. It was parked funny in the street. As he was parking his car, 5 members of the Avenues gang driving around in a van. They'd been driving around all night. They were armed with a shotgun, a .357, a 9mm, and a .380 automatic. They were looking for people to assault. They couldn't find anybody. They couldn't find anybody to assault. They came upon Kenny Wilson parking his car, and Alfredo Bird Martinez turned to his other cohorts and said, "There's a nigger, you guys want to kill him?" Apparently they did. They bailed out of the van as Kenny Wilson was parking his car. They unloaded on him with everything they had, and they killed him instantly. That murder hung in limbo for about a year and a half. They had no idea who or why they did this, who would do this, and why they did it. Because robbery was not involved. They didn't find any money on Kenny Wilson. It was one of those, quote, senseless murders. And it wasn't until a couple of months later that one of the guys in that van, looking at a sentence of 27 years to life for attempted murder of a police officer, decided to use that information that he had about the killing of Kenny Wilson to try and cut a deal for himself. And he spilled the beans. He named all the people that were in the van and what they did and why they did it, and the reason they did it was they didn't want blacks infesting Highland Park. And that's only one. That's one incident. There were 2 other blacks that were killed in Highland Park, numerous assaults. And when I try to tell this story, in the course of doing the research, there were similar incidents in Pomona and Compton, Orange County, San Fernando Valley. Roughly about 20 documented incidents that I have of mostly male blacks being killed by Hispanic street gang members for the benefit of essentially the Mexican Mafia, so they can maintain control of the drug trade. When I first approached various LA news media about these events, well documented in court cases, I was told that they didn't want to start a race war. This was something that they didn't want to get themselves involved in. None of them doubted the facts of the case, the facts of this information. It was all there in court records. They just chose to ignore them. And, I made numerous phone calls to the NAACP and Rainbow Push, and I said, there's this phenomenon that I came across, and you might be interested in it, and I'd really like your comment about it. I never got a call back. In 8 years and dozens of phone calls that I made to these groups, nobody seemed to be interested in the story, even groups that purport to care deeply about their membership. And it was only in July of 2006 when essentially the story could no longer be ignored, because at that point, U.S. Attorney Alex Bustamante and Barbara Bernstein filed federal hate crime charges against those 4 members of the Avenues gang who killed Kenny Wilson, Anthony Perdomo, and Christopher Bowser. All 3 are black males, all 3 non-gang affiliated, killed for the sin of being black in a Hispanic neighborhood for the benefit of the Mexican Mafia. Last week, the U.S. Attorney unsealed another indictment against the Florencia 13 gang, named 43 defendants in that filing. They were accused of a number of crimes, drug dealing, RICO statutes, and killing male blacks in their neighborhood for doing nothing other than being black. And it's a wonder to me that the media still chooses, for some reason, to ignore this. This is something that cannot, for some reason, be talked about. It baffles me. And it's interesting that I've been attacked by various people, namely sort of Hispanic civil rights groups, as being a racist, fanning the flames of racial discord and so on. And I can take the personal attacks, but the interesting thing is none of them have ever questioned me on the facts. This is not being made up out of whole cloth. This is happening every day in Los Angeles, and this organization has essentially put a death sentence on virtually every black that dares to enter a neighborhood. Now, this is not every neighborhood and not every gang, but every gang that has a special relationship or an alliance to the Mexican Mafia has been given this order. Florencia is one of them. Avenues was another. The Pomona P12, Pomona 12th Street has got that order. There was an incident where a young Hispanic kid who grew up literally next door with a friend of his who was black, happened to be black. They were friends all through grammar school. And one day he got jumped into Pomona's 12th Street. And as a member of Pomona's 12th Street, he was no longer allowed to associate with his black friend. And in fact, to show his new buddies in Pomona P12 that he was with them all the way, he ambushed his black friend, the kid who he went to birthday parties with, and shot him in the head with a .22. Didn't kill him, but this kid is now impaired for life, has severe cognitive issues and so on. To me, that underscores the power, the sort of insane power that the Mexican Mafia and the street gang culture has over people. I describe it as sort of as a cult. The gang comes before everything, comes before your friends, your family, even God. Once you join, you're in all the way, and there's virtually nothing that anybody could do to dissuade you from that, except sort of come to the realization that what you're doing is not only criminal, but it's evil. One of the other initiatives that the Mexican Mafia was involved in, and is still involved to this day, is the infiltration of drug intervention and gang intervention programs. In 1977, a fellow by the name of Alfie Sosa, who was a Mexican Mafia member, in an alliance with a fellow by the name of Michael Delia, who was an associate of Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, a Cosa Nostra member, infiltrated a group called, actually they didn't infiltrate it, they created a group called Get Going. This program was ostensibly created to get returning prisoners, parolees on the street, get them off drugs and put them into a productive life. They were financed with government money, LA City money, and a fellow by the name of Alex P. Garcia, who was state senator at the time, ran interference for them. He's the one who got them plenty of funding and so on. Alfie Sosa and his cohorts with Michael Delia used the money to buy cars, and they lived on Utah Street And their, quote, intervention center was actually nothing more than a drug distribution center for the Mexican Mafia. They drove around in government-sponsored cars, used their salaries to buy drugs, and distribute the drugs all over the state. And of course, they protected their turf from other drug dealers by shooting and killing them. The guns and, of course, everything else was bought with tax dollars. The lid finally blew off Project Get Going when the Ellen Delia, Michael Delia's wife, became aware of what had been going on with her program. And Alfie Sosa met her at the airport in Sacramento, took her about a mile and a half away and shot her in the head and dumped her body in a ditch. And then the public finally became aware of the infiltration. It had been so successful that virtually every single drug intervention program at that time, 1992, which LA financed to about $42 million a year, almost all that money had gone directly into the Mexican Mafia's treasury. When city administrators finally came to the realization that this was going on, Art Snyder, who was councilman at the time, I believe, or county supervisor, I forget which one, he took it upon himself to pull the plug on all these programs, and somebody did a drive-by on his headquarters. They shot up the place because they didn't want the plug pulled on their program. I wish I could say that those incidents are over and a part of history, but unfortunately they're not. To this day, there are drug intervention programs and gang intervention programs that are publicly financed and used as fronts for Mexican Mafia and gang drug dealing. Most recently, there was the case of Hector Marroquin, who ran a program called No Guns, and he was getting, I think, $1.5 million from the city to run these gang programs. And as it turned out, he was doing pretty much what Alfie Sosa was doing in the 1970s. He took some of that money and he bought a bar in Cudahy. His daughter was accused of murdering and setting on fire the body of one of her associates. The son was arrested for possession of firearms, even though he was not allowed to have firearms because he's a convicted felon. And after he was arrested, they realized that he was on the payroll of No Guns, receiving government money to run gang intervention programs, whereas in fact, he admitted that he was still a member of the 18th Street Gang and doing business for them. Hector has had his funding pulled, and soon thereafter he was shot, I think, twice or three times. He survived. The circumstance of that shooting is still unknown, but it's presumed that he had crossed somebody that he shouldn't have, and maybe was keeping too much money. It's what law enforcement tells me. And there was another case of another program which law enforcement tells me has also been infiltrated or may be infiltrated. A fellow by the name of Mario Corona, who was working for an organization called Communities and Schools in the West San Fernando Valley. College graduate, I think he got a master's in sociology or something, and went back into the streets very admirably to try and work with some of these gangsters to try to divert them from a life of crime, where unfortunately he was found with he was on a traffic stop. He was found holding a pound of methamphetamine and I believe, a firearm. There are other programs that I can't mention who law enforcement tells me have also been similarly infiltrated. We are spending about $82 million a year on gang intervention and drug intervention programs in Los Angeles City. And according to what Connie Rice was able to put together from her research, from the $700,000 grant that she got to investigate or analyze these programs, every single dollar of that $82 million has been misspent. They haven't been able to find one kid that was diverted away from gangs by this huge expenditure of money. Have all the programs been infiltrated? I don't know. But certainly, we may be able to, should be able to find a smarter way of spending that $82 million a year. Just a second, I'll get to you in a second. In addition to gang intervention programs and drug programs, the Mexican Mafia and their allies on the street have also managed to infiltrate some localities where they become essentially the government in these towns, and one of them being Cudahy. I don't know if you're aware of, there's been a couple of stories out in the papers, some of the papers, about the city of Cudahy, which has become essentially a fiefdom. The mayor's been accused of various crimes. It's sort of a gang R&R center, if you will. You can go there if you're a gang member and not fear molestation by the police, law enforcement, or the city fathers. Ironically, it's Cudahy is where Hector Marroquin decided to set up his bar. Is there a connection? There may be. This is not an accident. This is a program. This is a thoughtful method of gaining power by finding these small cities like Cudahy and others. Along the 710 corridor that runs from Long Beach to Pasadena, there are these small independent cities that have been infiltrated by criminal elements. And the criminal element has become the government. You know, you can ask, what is law, the ultimate, the question of course, should be asked is, what is law enforcement doing about it? Law enforcement is pedaling as hard and fast as it can to try to keep ahead of this thing, but they just don't have the resources for it. I'll give you an example. One of the main characters in my book is a DA named Anthony Manzella, whose specialty is prosecuting Mexican Mafia homicides and crimes and so on. And when he retires this year, the entire Mexican Mafia District Attorney Task Force retires with him because he is the task force. The MA was founded in 1957. Now we're into our 50th year of its existence, and the LA County District Attorney's Office does not have a Mexican Mafia prosecution specialist. Tony Manzella was it. And when he goes, all that corporate memory, all that information, everything that he had in his mind, in his brain, everything that he's been accumulating over the last 30 years as a prosecutor, prosecuting Mexican Mafia cases, goes with him. There's no passing the baton to another group because there is no other group. There's nobody there. And the same thing happened in 1992. In 1992, when those meetings took place that I told you about, there was an organization called the PGU, the Prison Gang Unit, created by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and their job was to surveil Mexican Mafia members and prison gang members when they hit the street, when they were paroled from the prison system. They knew full well, and to this day, that when one of these guys gets out of the prison system, within a couple of days or a couple of weeks, he's going to start capering again. He's going to start getting his neighborhood organized. He's going to start collecting taxes. He's going to start throwing his weight around, and of course, he's going to deal retribution to people that cross him. The PGU had been completely cannibalized, and all its members thrown to other assignments. There was one fellow left in the prison gang unit, a guy who had about 1 day's experience in the prison gang unit. He was a great cop. He was a good cop. He'd been a cop for a long time doing a lot of stuff. He had no knowledge of street gangs, had no knowledge of prison gangs. But he was the de facto prison gang unit for the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. So when you say that, you wonder, well, how can 1,500 to 2,000 gangsters show up at Elysian Park and not have anyone be aware of it ahead of time? It's because there was nobody around. There was no PGU, there was no intelligence gathering. All those resources had been spent elsewhere. And it was only by a miracle that of fortune and one good cop, a cop by the name of Roy Nunez, who managed to salvage that situation and turn it into 3 giant federal RICO cases against the Mexican Mafia in 1995, 97, and 99, where they sent about 30 guys to prison, most of them for life, and some of them, well, all of them in the federal system. Frankly, they can get away with it, and they continue to caper virtually unchallenged because, unfortunately, we just have not assigned the resources needed to address this organized crime group. Thanks. Hi there. Sure, yeah, you had your hands up. Oh, we got microphones. Hang on just 1 second, please.
Hi, I've been dying to ask a couple of questions. The main one is, when X amount of $1 million is dedicated to a program, there's no auditing of it? There's no
Simple
keeping
answer, no. There is none.
So-
When the city wrote checks to Hector Marroquin, their involvement in his program ended when the check cleared.
Who wrote the check?
As far as I know, I haven't been able to figure that one out. No one has taken credit or blame for well, the people who wrote the check, the organization, was the LA Bridges program. Who there? I don't know. Not one
There's
head.
no oversight whatsoever.
Not one head has rolled over that.
And the city council, nobody, there's no public figure that said anything about this?
No. They won't return phone calls.
So does that mean that there's a lot of public figures in on the whole thing? I would think so, because
Would that I could tell you. I don't know, because they don't return phone calls.
well, that
I've
goes
tried
to my
to
other
do a
question.
follow-up on Hector Marroquin and where that money went and who gave it to him, under what circumstances, what kind of program did he
The
did.
city has an auditing program. There's a treasurer that
Yeah, Laura Chick is her
is
name.
supposed to say, yeah, this is what happened and this is what didn't happen, but the office doesn't do that. I know she tried to audit the LAUSD and didn't get anywhere. So in other words, that office is totally useless.
So it would appear.
What am I doing living here?
Well, look, with these fires and this, the subject at hand tonight, it's starting to look like a Nathaniel West novel. Okay, so
Oh,
yeah,
thank you.
phone with you. Just 1 second till they get you the microphone.
I just have a question along the same lines as he does. LA put this whole thing on with Varagosa and Bratton about this whole, we're getting onto the gangs and all this. Is nothing being done on that? Because they do this big PR stunt.
Frankly, the only people that are really doing something about it is the federal government, the FBI, DEA, ICE, and with the help of some local law enforcement agencies, they are doing something about it. This Florencia 13 indictment last week, the results of a 3-year investigation. Yeah, they're doing something about it. The reason that local people, the local law enforcement, doesn't get after them is they really do not have the resources. When the federal government steps in, U.S. Attorney, FBI, and so on, they bring with them tremendous resources. Okay, and when I say tremendous resources, what I mean is cars that'll start in the morning, cars that, you're laughing, and it's absolutely true. If you work for a law enforcement agency and you try to get some real good undercover cars that look like they wouldn't look out of place where you park them, you can't get them. You can't get batteries for the really good body wires, or body wires that are good to begin with. So when the feds come in, all that stuff is suddenly available. It's like, the floodgates open and you got really good equipment and you got money for overtime and so on. When they do an investigation, they don't punch out at 5 o'clock because there's overtime money to be paid. LAPD, if you're doing surveillance and so on, you got to ask permission to work overtime. And once you reach a certain level of overtime, so that's it, no more. But if you're following one of these guys who's a major mover and so on, well, your morning may start out in Los Angeles. By the afternoon, you could be following into Arizona. And you can't just, and if you do just drop the situation, drop the case, he's off and there's nobody watching him. The feds can make all that happen. Sure, right there.
Thank you very much for writing this book. So Antonio Villagrosa is basically in charge of the police department, right? And he could lobby for increased funding for the police department to give the resources in order to fight this gang,
Right.
or these gangs.
Yeah.
How many members of the LA Bridges have contributed to Mayor Villagrosa's campaigns?
I have no idea.
There's $82 million missing.
It's not missing. It's been spent, but it's been spent
Well,
foolishly. Yeah.
we know it's been spent.
Yeah, oh,
But
yeah.
we don't know where.
We
So
don't
it's
know where.
missing,
Yeah, in a sense, yes.
in a sense. And this was distributed by the program called LA Gangs, which is, or what is it?
LA Bridges program.
LA Bridges,
Yeah.
that is supposed to tackle the gang problem.
Right.
So the members of the board of LA Bridges are prominent people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're appointed by Villagrosa. And my second question is, what do you propose to do? What's your answer to this problem?
Well, the conventional wisdom is you can't arrest your way out of the problem. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's accurate. You can't. There's been one area, Northeast Division in Los Angeles, where the Avenues gang ran rampant for years, and they killed those three blacks and so on. Over the course of 10 years, since 1995, again, purely by accident, with no intention, really, Avenues has been defanged to a tremendous degree. The Avenues gang had 4 members of the Mexican Mafia that had graduated from its ranks into the Mexican, 5 now, I think. First RICO indictment took out one of those guys. Subsequent investigations on the state and federal level took out the middle tier and then the more active foot soldiers. Over a 12-year period, by sustained, but again, accidental, really, pressure, law enforcement pressure, that gang is now virtually powerless, to the point where they've had to reach beyond their neighborhood to try to get somebody from the outside to run things, to run the business in that neighborhood. You could take one. I think that may be one approach. I think you have to put that kind of law enforcement pressure on the shot callers, the guys on top who are running the organization.
Was that in LA City?
It's in LA City, yeah.
So would you say that those gangs were non-compliant?
Non-compliant.
Is that what you're saying? They're non-compliant within the structure of the Mexican Mafia?
There's no one there to comply. All the shot callers, all the active guys, all the guys who are doing all the shooting and the robbing and the extortion and the drug collecting are all in jail.
Gross would want control over that. So he would send his troops up there to take care of it, right? I mean, that's almost an accusation. But
So it would seem. But there's another part of that you really do have to, believe it or not, I really feel deeply for these kids growing up in these neighborhoods, because some of them don't have a chance. They really do not have a chance. Their father, their mother, their uncles, their brothers, cousins, everybody they know, anybody who's a figure to them, is involved in gangs. They're either in a gang or in the Mexican Mafia. And some of these kids, that's all they know. That's their entire world. And it takes some kind of, I don't know what kind of government program, short of complete deprogramming, like you would deprogram a cult member, to get these kids turned around, because they are the next generation of really active, hardcore criminals, because that's all they've ever known. I think it would take a combination of that kind of pressure from the top, getting rid of the active leaders, and then some kind of pressure from the bottom to actually deprive the organization and the gangs of its future membership. Get these kids sidetracked, turned around, make them realize that there's no glory, there's no honor to being a gang member and to aspiring to be a Mexican Mafia member, because some of these kids do. They think that's where I want to go. They grow up at the age of 15 thinking, I want to be a shot caller for the MA.
A key part of this is the ease with which the prisons are used in effect as corporate headquarters. It's been reported that the prison guard union, which is very powerful, especially with the governor's office, militates in favor of relaxed conditions in the prison because it makes life easier for their members. To what degree is laxness fostered by the prison guard union a contributing factor in this?
I don't think the COs, the correction officers, are are lax. I think what allows inmates to operate with the kind of freedom they do is not the COs, the guys who deal with them every day. It's sort of the prison policies.
Who makes those policies?
Well, it's the California Department of Corrections, people in Sacramento. You know, the COs are just there basically to lock them up at night. And
What about the union?
I'm not really familiar with much of what the union leadership does except ask for more money. The prison union does not create policy for the California Department of Corrections. That's a political issue that's done in Sacramento. Prisoners to this day are allowed to have bank accounts, which is one of the ways that Mexican Mafia and other prison gangs launder their money. The California Department of... Yes. You, for instance, could write a check to anybody in the prison system right now for $5,000. That money will be deposited in that prisoner's bank account, and he could use it as he wants. No, you send it right to the prison. You send it to Corcoran, and they'll put it in that prisoner's bank account. And they will not come to you and ask you, where did you get that money? Where does that money come from? It could be dirty money. It could be money from drug sales. It could be whatever. But once it hits the prison system, it suddenly becomes clean money. So in a sense, the CDC has become the de facto banker of the Mexican Mafia.
Does the Mexican Mafia control the Salvadorian gangs? That
Yeah. MS-13?
Yeah.
Yeah, in LA they do. Wherever there's a Mexican Mafia presence, MS-13 is essentially obeys them. Outside of where there is no Mexican Mafia influence, like back east or some of the northeastern states, MS-13 runs their own game. But where there is a Mexican Mafia presence, MS-13 is subservient in a sense.
And how did you learn so much about the Mexican Mafia?
I've been talking to people for 10 years about it. Just DAs, cops, dropouts, did street interviews and so on. Looked at a lot of court documents, court cases. Right.
Two things. One, the comment about the correction officers. They're under threat by the prisoners. They've been assaulted. Oh, sure. I used to work with them. They're beat up. They have to be very careful in order to survive. So sure. I don't think it's that the union is lax. I think they're afraid for their own lives.
Yeah, well, they have a lot to be afraid of. I mean, they get gassed,
Yes.
periodically, and they
Yes.
get shot, not shot at, but they are the victims of a lot of different kinds of weapons. Weapons that, yeah.
Yes, they are. The point, there's an interesting point that was made or raised about how high this reaches into the government of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. It reminds me of the situation, the Mafia in Sicily. Everybody's aware of the Mafia in Sicily, and to the highest levels of government, sure. They look the other way because of intimidation or threats. Mm-hmm. The point may be that in the city, the very highest levels of government, that there are reasons why this is left the way it is, whether this is a big constituency, whether they themselves are intimidated, they just leave it alone. And even in the newspapers, they won't address this, or the media won't address this, for good reason.
That may be the case.
Do you think that's good enough reason not to do anything about it? To just ignore it? To deny it? Or do you think we should do something? Oh, I know. I understand.
Yeah.
The government was able to break the back of the Mafia, the Italian Mafia. Yeah. Why can they not apply the same technique and principles to the Mexican Mafia?
It's a great question. Organizationally, they're very different. The Italian Mafia is a standard sort of pyramid-shaped organization. They've got a chairman of the board, and they've got board members, family heads, soldiers, and so on. If you could take out those couple of top three ranks, you could pretty much disable them and disrupt activities. Mexican Mafia is horizontally organized. There's only one rank, and that's Carnal. And basically, when you're inducted, it's like being given a franchise. Okay, you now own the franchise for Highland Park, or you own it for Pomona, and so on. So there is no leadership to go after. It's based like a cell. Absolutely correct. However, That does not mean that it's not possible to disrupt and dismantle them. You know, these federal prosecutions have proven that you can do that. It takes political will and money.
Tony, I got a question for you, and it might be too large to answer. It's just too broad at this point. But last weekend, the newspapers quoted, the Assemblyman Fabian Nunez stated, Los Angeles has become the gang capital of the world. And I'm wondering what allows Los Angeles to persist on this level of gang infiltration, I would say.
You know, it's an interesting question, and the only way I can answer that is by saying that the gang mentality has developed its own culture. I mean, this is a self-perpetuating culture. You know, you've got gang record labels, and I don't mean like Def Records and so on. These are labels most of you have never heard of. One of them was a label invented by the Noisner Familia in Northern California, with whose artist was a fellow by the name of Sir Dino, who sold tens of thousands of CDs in not in the Blockbuster or any of these major chains. They were sold in grocery stores and out of car windows, in bodegas and so on. This guy was a huge hit, made a lot of money on a label that nobody ever heard of. And there are similar there's a whole Serrano gang record industry, or CD industry, it's not records anymore, that celebrate the lifestyle. And you've got the music. There's a brand of clothing called Torchita Clothing, again, that celebrates the gang lifestyle. When the T-shirt says high power module, and anybody who reads that who knows what they're talking about, high power module is where the Mexican Mafia guys are kept in the LA County Jail. That's high power, 1700 block. So you've got music, you've got clothes. There are magazines devoted to this sort of Serrano lifestyle. You've got parents who were gangsters. When the kids are born, they put a blue rag around their head because blue is the color of the Serrano movement, the Southsiders. You see baby pictures, and I've seen these, and I've been in some papers. 2-year-old kid in a crib holding a 380 and a blue rag around their head, because there's a new member for the gang, and they're still associated with it. They may be married and have kids, and they fully expect their kids to become gang members. So it's a culture. It's a self-perpetuating culture. It's not like some kid just suddenly, deciding to be, although that does happen, suddenly overnight deciding to be a gang member. He's growing up in a gang culture, whether it's his family or his immediate neighborhood. And why is LA the capital? I'm sorry? Yeah.
What, in your opinion, since you've been studying this for a long time, what, in your opinion, can average citizens do anything to try to alleviate the situation? Because to me, it looks like it's gone up. If somebody was a gang member, and he could be a council member now, or even mayor, and he still could have loyalty to that. He could be anywhere in government.
Well, all that is possible. The Cosa Nostra showed that 50 years ago.
So what can the average citizen do to bring this to light, if anything?
Get informed and vote correctly, I guess. I mean, just to give you an example, when Mike Hernandez, the now disgraced member of the city council, was caught doing cocaine and so on in city council chambers, if you remember them, the fellow who was supplying his cocaine was the brother of a Mexican Mafia member. LASD had surveillance of Mike Hernandez blowing the coke right on the fender of his car in broad daylight in public.
Because I also understand, from listening to people and hearing what's going on, that a lot of judges, for instance, have thrown drug cases out of court because they themselves are purchasing drugs from the people that
I have no
appeared in front of them.
evidence of that. I don't know anything about that. I have never heard that.
I've
I
heard
do know I do know, however, that often, not often, but I guess sometimes, shouldn't say often, street cops are reluctant to testify in court against gang members because their families still live in those neighborhoods. I know that for a fact. And you would imagine that, this sort of thing, law enforcement officers, sworn officers being afraid to testify in court for fear of retaliation is the kind of thing that only happens in third world countries. It's happening here in Los Angeles.
That's it. Thank you.
Tony Rafael.